Le capitalisme engendre une dynamique permanente d'accumulation, de crise et d'innovation.
I believe that open markets and free enterprise are the best imaginable force for improving human wealth and happiness.
Je pense que les forces sociales et politiques sont les forces centrales dans la dynamique du capitalisme.
Did you ever have a moment of doubt about capitalism?
Is there some society you know that doesn't run on greed?
How would Smith see the economic world around us?
I think Keynes would have said the problem is the hole in the economy.
Hayek really wrote The Road to Serfdom as a warning.
You always have to be careful with Marx about the one-liners.
Polanyi, for me, was an intellectual earthquake.
I mean, if I had to stereotype Ricardo, I would say he would look like George Soros.
Si vous retournez chez Adam Smith, Marx, Schumpeter, vous avez des embryons de mécanismes vous permettant de comprendre la crise actuelle.
We were told that capitalism is the product of big thinkers and big ideas. But is it true? How did ideas shape our lives? What is their relation to reality? Can they help us understand today's economic crisis, let alone the future of capitalism?
Clarion call of industry sounds good morning to America's manpower. In thousands of homes, vigorous workmen rise to meet a new day and a new opportunity.
I'm 44 years old, was born and raised here in Flint, Michigan. A third-generation GM worker. I'm an electrician and been president of UAW Local 651 for 6 years. I'm married with 4 children.
Since the late 70s and early 80s, General Motors began closing its factories in Flint, the city of its birth, moving them first to Mexico and later to China.
This is the Dort Highway complex. The other side where 10,000 people were working. It's the first time I've been on here since they tore everything down.
The economic tornado that ripped through Flint, uprooting GM factories and eliminating dozens of thousands of jobs, was not an act of God, but a man-made disaster. An unavoidable disaster, we have been told, if we want to follow the theory of globalized free market. A market envisioned in the 19th century by 2 friends, David Ricardo and Thomas Malthus. This is the story of how contemporary economic and political interests helped to forge a globalized market in the name of 19th century ideas.
We're now in the heart of the City of London, and these are the streets where David Ricardo would have walked about, done his business. This is where we're standing now, right in front of the Royal Exchange building. But remember, the Royal Exchange, founded in 1565, almost 200 years before David Ricardo's time. And stockbrokers, particularly in the 17th century, were banned because they were considered rather rude and uncouth. So to trace his history, we need to go down the right-hand side of the Royal Exchange building here, down this street, to some of the back alleys of the City of London, where Ricardo and the other stockbrokers met.
Ricardo was born in England, studied in England. His real education is from he's 14 years old. He starts working with his father in the stock exchange. The stock exchange at this point is a relatively loose, set of people that meet in coffee shops and in Change Alley. So it's close to the Bank of England.
Jonathan's Coffee House was set up on this spot. And at some point in that last quarter of the 1700s, someone carved the name Stock Exchange over the doorway to New Jonathan's Coffee House. And so the London Stock Exchange, I guess, was really born at that point.
You have to remember that this is the period of the 18th century in which England is involved in several, global trade wars. It's the mercantile center of the world. Although it's primitive from many respects, this is the most modern stock exchange in the world. Ricardo, does very well. We know that from early age, 15, 16, he's already trading on the side on his own account. By the time he's 20, he's already a wealthy man. In 1796, he's well off. He's buying property. He's spending time in Bath. In one of those stays in Bath, in a very fancy hotel, reads for the first time The Wealth of Nations of Adam Smith. Adam Smith's book gets him thinking about political economy in a broader sense.
The produce of the earth, all that is derived from its surface by the united application of labor, machinery, and capital, is divided among three classes of the community, namely the proprietor of the land, the owner of the stock or capital necessary for its cultivation, and the laborers by whose industry it is cultivated. David Ricardo, The Principles of Political Economy and Taxation.
Au début du 19e siècle, beaucoup d'observateurs, comme Ricardo, commencent à s'inquiéter des conséquences à long terme de l'exode rural, la croissance démographique, l'industrialisation sur la structure de la société, sur la répartition des richesses dans la société à long terme. Chez Ricardo, ça prend la forme suivante, c'est vraiment l'idée que le prix de la terre agricole, à long terme, pourrait absorber une part de plus en plus forte de toutes les richesses. Donc c'est vraiment l'idée que les propriétaires fonciers, si on ne fait rien, vont finir infiniment riches. Pourquoi? Alors dans l'esprit de Ricardo, c'est vraiment lié au fait que la terre va devenir infiniment rare à long terme.
Indeed, a pessimistic vision of a stagnant economy. Land that is overpriced, unable to feed a rapidly growing population, and unproductive landlords who only collect rent. The source of this anxiety was this man, Thomas Malthus, a friend of Ricardo's whose essay on population growth deeply influenced English intellectuals at the time.
Malthus is born in 1766. Most of his education's at home. He goes to a Unitarian-type school setting before he goes off to college for a little bit of time. Then he goes to Cambridge. 1798 is the famous date. This is when he publishes his first essay. Doesn't put his name on it. Okay? His first essay is called an essay on population.
In his essay, Malthus theorized in the 19th century how human population growth outpaces its capacity to produce food.
So he says, what holds human numbers in check? He says, misery and vice. And by misery, what he's talking about is all those things that cause death.
Thomas Malthus, who fancied himself something of a mathematician, summarily decided that the world would be out of food by 1890. He blamed reduced mortality rates.
C'est important de bien voir que les penseurs économiques sont des êtres politiques, comme chacun d'entre nous. Ils voient le monde autour d'eux. Dans les années 1790, le monde autour des Anglais qui réfléchissent sur le monde, c'est notamment la Révolution française. Cette inquiétude très politique face à l'évolution de la Révolution française est tout à fait centrale pour expliquer, pour comprendre la peur de Malthus par rapport à la surpopulation. C'est-à-dire qu'il y a vraiment cette idée, oh là là, le monde moderne peut devenir une chose terrible, parce que la croissance de la population va nous précipiter tous dans la misère des masses et dans la révolution.
But David Ricardo had an antidote to his friend's nightmare. Like Adam Smith, he would explore the mechanism for economic growth and expansion. But unlike Smith, his was not a vision, but a series of theoretical models meant to liberate the market and encourage private initiatives. Today, in the 21st century, it is the World Trade Organization that has adapted David Ricardo's ideas.
Elle a été très bien expliquée à l'époque par M. Ricardo, elle est toute simple. C'est que si vous faites quelque chose mieux que moi, et si je fais quelque chose mieux que vous, alors nous avons tous les deux intérêt à ouvrir notre échange. Je vais bénéficier de votre savoir-faire, vous allez bénéficier de mon savoir-faire. Ça, c'est ce que dit Ricardo, en gros.
60-second adventures in economics. Fear of foreign competition once led countries to try and produce everything they needed and impose heavy taxes to keep out foreign goods. However, economist David Ricardo showed that international trade could actually make everyone better off, bringing in one of the first great economic models.
Ricardo even gave the theory a name, comparative advantage. The theory was born out of a violent debate at the time over a high tariff on the importation of wheat, then called corn, thus keeping the price of bread high. It was Ricardo's way to fight the power of local landlords, encourage competition, and lower the price of bread.
Ricardo noticed the following. He says, look, imagine that England and Portugal, each one produces two goods. So he says cloth and wine. You see, you're producing two things, I'm producing two things. I'm better at producing this thing here, cloth. And you're better at producing wine. So why should I be producing cloth and wine when I can specialize, get my comparative advantage, my particular advantage at producing cloth, and produce more cloth, so I'll be producing more than if I specialize in both things. And then you that are better off at producing wine, you specialize in producing wine, and you'll be better off.
By specializing, they can then export these surpluses to each other, and both end up better off. This is the principle of comparative advantage.
Il y avait des hypothèses extrêmement particulières. Il y avait plein emploi, tous les pays avaient accès à la même technologie. Donc il y avait, comme les magiciens, si vous voulez, il y avait un truc. On a oublié le truc et on a vendu comme universelle la loi que tous les pays ont intérêt à utiliser. Et alors, à une époque où il y a quelques cyniques, on a utilisé de façon rhétorique ce résultat théorique pour forcer les marchés.
So is Ricardo's theory a magician's trick, or an engine of growth and prosperity?
Foreign trade is highly beneficial to a country, as it increases the amount and variety of the objects on which revenue may be expended, and affords, by the abundance and cheapness of commodities, incentives to saving and to the accumulation of capital. David Ricardo, The Principles of Political Economy and Taxation.
Monsieur Ricardo avait imaginé son système, mais dans un monde dans lequel la distance était encore un facteur de viscosité de l'échange international. On était loin, les transports étaient coûteux. Ce qui s'est passé depuis M. Ricardo, c'est que la technologie, les modes de transport, la conteneurisation, Internet, ont incroyablement rétréci ces coûts de l'échange qui étaient liés à la distance, de telle sorte que sa théorie devient beaucoup plus efficace aujourd'hui qu'elle ne l'était dans le passé.
Our investigation into the theory and its adaptation in the 21st century begins in Flint.
When I was working over here for the first time when Division 11 was at its peak, I was probably 25, 26 years old, you know, and I think about the enthusiasm, you know, you're not thinking about what would happen, you know, 20 years down the road, really. You know, I had a secure job, loved my job, loved being an electrician, loved the people. At that point, I was starting to get involved more and more with the union, so talking with them more and more and having more discussions with management and standing up for their rights. So I was really coming into it as things were starting to decline. But to see weeds grow where we used to build things that were in every General Motors vehicle is just, it's just terrible. Wow.
So if the magic did not work in Flint, it supposedly should work in Mexico, General Motors' new home.
Estados Unidos es un país intenso en capital y México es un país intenso en mano de obra. Si nosotros ponemos juntos a estos dos países, sin duda alguna, tiene que haber una gran complementariedad y eso también es lo que se ha visto.
But the magic does not work everywhere. In the Mexican countryside, free trade is not seen as a promise, but as a threat, with the opening of the country to cheaper U.S. corn.
Las gentes esas que están ahí al frente de secretarías y eso, hacen políticas agrícolas o agroalimentarias, agropecuarias. No, a nosotros, por ejemplo, no nos espanta el Tratado de Libre Comercio, pero yo siento que nosotros, bueno, como agricultor y como campesino que somos, estamos en desigualdad de circunstancias. Por ejemplo, los productores gringos tienen muchos apoyos, muchos subsidios. Nosotros nos dan el procampo de 1,100, 1,200 pesos por hectárea.
But how did Ricardo reconcile the reality of seeking cheap labor and new markets with his vision of a win-win for all?
There are two important clauses that are made explicit in his book. One, everybody that loses a job in the production of cloth in Portugal has to get a job in the production of wine in Portugal, and vice versa in England. So everybody that was producing wine has to get a job producing cloth. So there is an intrinsic assumption that people can find jobs. Ricardo very explicit says no capital mobility. So you have to assume that the capitalist that is deciding to produce the cloth because you're good here, because you have the technology, doesn't have the following idea. Wait a second. They don't produce anything. They have very low wages. They're willing to work for peanuts. What if I take my technology here and move it to the other country and produce from there and just sell here?
So GM leaving Flint had nothing to do with free trade or David Ricardo, but everything to do with a search for cheaper labor.
The notion of free trade is all about this favoring certain particular groups. Those are fundamentally big corporations that have become, I should say, financial conglomerates. So they can switch very fast from one area to another area and whatnot. So from that point of view, it's a certain model of society, which, it's sold to the public, not just with the rhetoric of free and freedom and whatnot, but also with the rhetoric of scientific knowledge.
So what is the real history of free trade once we remove the rhetoric of science and the veil of Ricardo's concept of comparative advantage?
Global free market was created by imperialism, created by gunboats, created by cannon, British cannon. Without this gunboat and cannon and colonization, that Britain just couldn't create market for its own product.
No gunboats today, but ships loaded with goods produced in southern China on their way to the world's markets. Testimony to China's growing economic strength. But these kids are not here to see the ships, but the museum that stands nearby, commemorating the naval battle that took place here only 15 years after David Ricardo's death. Free trade by the power of a gun. It was called the Opium War, and for its anniversary, the Chinese government even commissioned a film to commemorate it.
In the late 18th century, the British tried to sell cotton textile and wool textile first, and both failed. First of all, the trading area in China is relatively warm, so the wool doesn't work, and then China has a more advanced textile industry.
The only way England could balance, trade with the Chinese was fundamentally through guns and the boats and selling them opium. So it's generating a need for this opium and generating actually the enslavement, if you want, of people in the sense, with the drug and so on and so forth. So that's the history of how free trade develops.
The rapid rise of addiction in China alarmed the emperor. He ordered his commissioner Lin Zetsu to ban opium sale, destroy the existing opium, and arrest the merchants. The ball was now in Queen Victoria's court.
If I were in Lin Zexu's position, I would also burn all the opium. But now it's not the opium issue, nor the issue of the lives and properties of a few merchants. If all nations follow China's example and reject free trade, the British Empire will no longer exist within a year. This is the reason for us to use force.
The British Navy went to war, defeating the technologically inferior Chinese army. China was forced to open more trading posts for foreign merchants and secede the island of Hong Kong to Britain, all in the name of free trade.
The situation of the creation of a global free market through imperialism, through guns, through cannons, is very similar to the globalization that we see in the last 20, 30 years. That now the standard story, of course, is that everybody is dying to get to the global free market, and then after that, everybody can exploit their competitive advantage and enjoy the free market and things like that. But if you look back to the actual history of the rise of the global free market in the last 20, 30 years, it is not so.
Claire Motel is a refugee whose plight was caused by so-called free trade. No gunboats were involved, only international loans.
La vie a tellement dit, même si vous avez $50 dans mon qui petit, ou pas qu'à faire manger avec, ou pas qu'à faire rien avec les autres femmes. Ou obligé chita, c'est commerce pour ta fait. L'on fait commerce au moins femme ou obligé. Parce que Port-au-Prince de l'eau c'est acheter. Tout ça ou besoin c'est acheter. La vie a venu au moins du pour, mais si ou femme moi fait commerce. Ou à petit gens, même si c'est pas solution à joindre non, moi à petit gens, mais c'est chita chaque jour lever et femme mouiller de l'eau c'est acheter le savon, c'est acheter.
Claire Martel was once a rice producer here in the Artibonite region, but was forced to abandon her land.
Le premier coup reçu par la position agricole, ça a été le processus de libéralisation entamé avec le coup d'État dans les années tout de suite après 86. On a eu une invasion du marché national par une énorme quantité de riz à très bon marché, avec des différences énormes par rapport au prix du riz national. Ça aussi a conduit à un appauvrissement rapide des producteurs paysans qui aujourd'hui sont dans la misère, ils sont obligés d'émigrer vers Port-au-Prince, vers la ville, pour chercher du travail qu'ils ne trouvent pas d'ailleurs.
The demand to liberalize Haiti's market and those of many other developing nations came from Washington. It was a condition for a loan from the International Monetary Fund, an organization established after the Second World War to promote, among others, Ricardo's ideas of free trade to generate growth.
The Allies had barely landed at Normandy when the idea of a monetary fund began to move rapidly from concept to reality. The idea was that by working together to increase world economic welfare, nations would also increase the chance of political peace. With war still raging, the foundation was laid for the International Monetary Fund.
From the 1950s, and particularly during the 1960s, many countries became independent. Countries that we now call developing countries or emerging markets began to have stronger growth prospects, they tried to borrow in order to finance the investments they needed, and then they started to run into trouble.
When countries face economic crises or want to prevent them, they can turn to the IMF for advice and loans to help put out their fire and restore stability. Any member of the IMF, be it rich, middle income, or poor, can ring the bell to ask for a loan. These loans come in various shapes and sizes. They're cheaper than other sources and are tailored to specific needs.
They came in and said, all right, we'll give you bridge loans, we'll help you pay, restructure your debt, but there will be conditions. The conditions were essentially those of extreme free market ideology and opening the country to outright pillage by transnational corporations.
Look, don't give me a hard luck story. I hear them every day, and quite frankly, they bore me. The facts are simple. In 1973, this bank gave you a loan, and you still haven't paid it back.
If these countries get into trouble and can't make their payments to their external creditors, should you let them fall, which is what they did in the interwar period between World War I and World War II, and that was very bad, or do you bring in a more multilateral body based on a ideally rules-based system to manage the renegotiation of debts and to help put the country on a more sustainable path?
Times are tough, and we're all having to clamp down. And don't look at me like that. This is a bank, not a charity.
In Ghana, as in Haiti, loans to alleviate the country's debt were given on condition of opening up the country's economy to foreign investment. The program even has a neutral name, Structural Adjustment Program.
This market shows to you the mass unemployment that is in Ghana. You see across the street everywhere, people are selling goods and services, and it's become part of the informal sector. Part of Thailand, American rice, Vietnamese rice. This is rice that we are now importing. So this is what happens when you liberalize the economy. Cheap importation of goods, of these goods and services coming in at the expense of local manufacturing business.
On a eu, il y a une vingtaine d'années, des critiques contre la mondialisation. Leur argument principal était ce système n'est pas bon pour les pays en développement. Parce que ouvrir la concurrence entre des pays pauvres et des pays riches, entre des pays faibles et des pays puissants, c'est le pot de terre contre le pot de fer. Le pot de terre sera toujours perdant.
Ce mécanisme supposé vertueux chez les économistes où un pays possède un autre pays et investit son capital dans un autre pays, ça n'a pas du tout marché. Parce que, en fait, être possédé par un autre pays, c'est pas forcément un gage de développement humain, social et politique réussi.
Liberalizing our economy meant to open up your markets to foreign interests. So therefore, most of the state industries that you see around us were either sold off to foreign private investors or were knocked down and new buildings were built.
L'expérience prouve, si vous regardez l'histoire économique des 50 dernières années, que les pays qui ont ouvert leurs échanges ont eu, en moyenne, des résultats économiques et donc, dans la plupart des cas sociaux, bien meilleurs que les États qui ne l'ont pas fait ou qui l'ont fait dans une moindre mesure. L'exemple extrême, qui est extrême, étant la péninsule coréenne. Une Corée du Sud qui s'est très bien développée parce qu'elle s'est ouverte, et une Corée du Nord qui est dans l'état que nous connaissons parce qu'elle est restée fermée.
le voit notamment les pays asiatiques, d'abord le Japon, puis la Corée, Taïwan, aujourd'hui la Chine, qui rattrapent le niveau de production des pays occidentaux, c'est essentiellement par un rattrapage du niveau de productivité, de technologie. Alors que c'est pas du tout parce que les pays occidentaux se seraient mis à investir massivement au Japon et en Chine. C'est exactement le contraire.
When you live through it, you don't realize it. But later, looking back, I lived through one of the most rapid socio-economic transformations in human history. I've realized that the kind of economic transformation that I have seen in my 40-odd years of life is equivalent to what happened in England between now and the time of George III. That was when the United States was still a British colony. This transformation was achieved through what is known as infant industry protection.
Visitors in the museum pass in front of life-size wax figures of South Korea's architects of industrialization, all military figures who built the country's first steel mill, the key to its industrialization. The project was rejected by the World Bank and international investors as overly ambitious and impossible for a poor country like Korea at the time. Yet Korea found alternative financing. The company was established as state-owned and was headed by an army general. Today, POSCO is the world's third largest steel mill.
This is a direct affront to standard economic theory. I mean, this project went against almost every known doctrine in standard economics. Not a single case in history in which countries achieved development through that process.
I'm Amy Goodman here with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, as people around the world continue to protest the soaring prices of basic food items, the World Food Program has described the crisis as a silent tsunami.
In its report, the UN faulted the so-called liberalization program for gutting agricultural production. Developing countries did not only fail to industrialize, they lost their capacity to feed their people.
Nowhere is this perhaps more clear than in the case of Haiti. 30 years ago, Haiti had all the rice it needed. Then in 1986, Haiti turned to the IMF for a loan. Now, after cutting tariff protections on local rice, Haiti imports most of its rice from the United States, which in turn remains heavily subsidized.
Since 1981, the United States has followed a policy that we rich countries that produce a lot of food should sell it to poor countries and relieve them of the burden of producing their own food. So thank goodness they can leap directly into the industrial era. It has not worked. It's maybe been good for some of my farmers in Arkansas, but it has not worked. It was a mistake. It was a mistake that I was a party to. I am not pointing the finger at anybody. I did that. I have to live every day with the consequences of the lost capacity to produce a rice crop in Haiti to feed those people.
His theory has been used and abused over centuries. So why did David Ricardo come up with an economic assumption which can hardly, if ever, be fulfilled?
In every economy for the last 1,000 years, you have had one set of economists representing the financial sector and one set representing the national interest of industry and agriculture. Ricardo was the spokesman for British bankers. Today we'd call him a bank lobbyist. He had the following problem. In his day, people were pointing to the fact that 3/4 of Britain's budget after the Napoleonic Wars went to pay interest to bondholders. And there were arguments against foreign loans. So Ricardo had the same argument that the subsequent post-classical economists had. He said, let's not look at debt at all. I'm going to create a view of the economy as if the whole economy worked on barter without any debt at all, as if there was no money, and money is only a veil.
C'est vrai qu'il a les intérêts de sa classe, qui sont plutôt les intérêts d'un agent de change, d'un financier. Je pense quand même que par moment, il défend ses intérêts, mais par moment, comme chacun d'entre nous, il essaye aussi de raisonner d'un strict point de vue désintéressé et d'un point de vue logique.
Je crois que Ricardo illustre la victoire des logiciens dans la théorie économique. Et en un sens, Ricardo est le fondateur de la mathématisation contemporaine. Je fournis des concepts qui permettent une habile mathématisation qui montre que l'équilibre va se prévaloir, même si dans la réalité il n'existe pas. Et donc moi je trouve qu'effectivement il a un grand rôle en légitimant des hypothèses fausses afin de justifier un modèle. Donc c'est lui l'un des grands fondateurs de cette idée.
The impact of free trade in the 21st century might have been less dramatic had it not been for David Ricardo's fight to free labor. Until the early 19th century, workers could not move from place to place, searching for work and selling their labor. David Ricardo was determined to change all that. For this fight, he was joined by his friend Thomas Robert Malthus. Port-au-Prince, the Haitian capital, could be described as a Malthusian nightmare, very much like English cities of his time. But in the 18th century, impoverished former peasants could get state assistance through their local parish. Thomas Malthus was furious.
What it's doing, it's allowing people who can't provide for themselves and their children to actually get married and have children. It's also ruining their motivation to work.
David Ricardo, who was by now a member of Parliament, agreed. He demanded that wages, like all other contracts, should be left to the fair and free competition of the market, and should never be controlled by the interference of the legislature. In other words, subsidies to the poor corrupt market laws.
In 1832, they have a commission to come up with a new set of poor laws, a national commission, and the Poor Law Amendment takes place in 1834, and it does take into consideration the criticisms of both Malthus and Ricardo. And the idea is we'll build workhouses, and the conditions in the workhouse ought to be poorer than the conditions for the poorest worker who isn't in a workhouse.
Paupers entering the workhouse really was the last resort for them. Previously, prior to the 1834 Poor Law Amendment Act, those in need would have had outdoor relief and they resided in their homes. Now they were compelled to come into the workhouse and work for their living.
Stand still. Hearken to what I have to tell you. First off,
You've all got an order of admittance, I trust, and any rabble you've brought with you will be taken away. Then you'll be stripped and washed. Once you're clean, you'll be given your workhouse uniform. It is not your property.
Charles Dickens, in the middle part of that 19th century, is writing about workhouses, and the workhouses he has in mind are the ones that came into play after that 1834 revision of the law.
Gentlemen, it is my considered opinion that our charity is being presumed upon. Hear, hear.
It did have a big impact, and I think if you think in terms of labor, finally, British society becomes a true market society. Labor is freed up along now with land and capital. Workers need to find work. Their wage level is determined by market forces. They can move. There is no longer any easy subsidy. And you've got your true capitalist market society. And in some ways, both Malthus and Ricardo played a role.
There's no need to imagine the impact of labor being freed up in 19th century English society. China today is as close as one can get.
China, over the last 30 or 40 years, if you think about it, 30 years ago, the vast majority of the population lived in rural places, basically a peasantry. Where did you get over the last really 20 to 25 years this huge workforce that now exists in all your southern coastal cities in China? If you have a hugely rural population where the vast majority of people were agriculturalists, and you had communal ownership of land, and then you made land private property, even if you initially divided up the land and gave everyone a piece of land, quite soon you would have some people losing their land and other people gaining more land. So you'd quickly have large landowners and small landowners, and then you would have quickly a large landless population. That again became a potential workforce.
A workforce that, thanks to David Ricardo and Thomas Malthus, has been freed to move in search of jobs, selling their labor in a globalized marketplace.
They left the village and flooded to the city. They changed their situation from being peasants in a very traditional rural setting to being workers in a global capitalist system.
A global labor force allowed GM to open factories in China and Mexico, leaving workers in Flint who could not compete with nowhere to go.
We are now entering the neighborhood that I lived in the early 80s when I first started practicing law here in Flint. This neighborhood has houses that were built by General Motors when it was bringing up workers to the area for their factories. There's nobody to buy these houses, and there's no money to tear them down. And so, bit by bit, the neighborhoods become emptier and sadder.
Flint is a Ricardian nightmare. First, General Motors left town in search of cheap labor, twisting Ricardo's concept of free trade. Secondly, in a modern adaptation of his and Thomas Malthus' debate about the poor laws, the state of Michigan has begun eliminating some of the subsidies given to the poor.
On Wednesday, the Republican-controlled Senate passed a House bill that puts a 48-month cap on state welfare benefits. Democratic Senator Gretchen Whitmer says another tool for the disadvantaged has been taken away.
We've got too many kids in poverty as it is, and that's not how you move a state forward.
For the last 6 months, our organization has been challenging a policy of the Michigan Department of Human Services that has cut over 30,000 families or 30,000 people off of public assistance. They basically decided that we're not going to focus on who do we help and what does it take to get them out of poverty, but instead, how much money are we going to save and who can we go after to make it impossible for them to get help?
Without the help of the state, my kids would be going hungry. And I'm not even going to allow that.
So we have these notions that came out in the context of that Malthusian Ricardo discussion of poor laws that has really not ended. And it has to do, to some extent, with how much power should labor have. And to the extent that your safety net is high, to the extent that you have minimum wages that actually provide living wages, you're empowering labor, aren't you? And that's often viewed as being problematic in the context of larger global capitalism.
David Ricardo died on September 11th, 1822. He was only 52 years old. Only a few visit his grave in rural England. Only few of the general public even know who he is. Yet in his name, an entire globe has been transformed, creating unimaginable wealth, but also huge destruction.
Ricardo fait le coup de force suivant. Il va isoler l'économie des autres sciences sociales et permettre un raisonnement d'économie pure. Et c'est ça qui le rend si essentiel dans l'histoire de la pensée. Alors que Adam Smith ouvrait complètement sur une articulation avec le droit, le rôle du prince, le rôle des processus de socialisation, alors que Ricardo va spécialiser l'économie expliquée par l'économie. Et c'est vrai qu'à mon avis, c'est là une grande bifurcation, si vous voulez, qui est intervenue dans l'histoire des doctrines économiques.
David Ricardo and Thomas Malthus helped to restructure society according to the logic of the market. But society soon rebelled, giving birth to a powerful new voice and a new understanding of the logic of capital.